4 different governments controlled Robben Island in the centuries before its most famous prisoner ever set foot there. Dutch, British, colonial, Apartheid. Every single one of them reached for the same rule. Move the problem across the water, and it stops being a problem you have to look at. A Khoikhoi translator was the first man banished under that rule in the 17th century. A future president was the last 300 years later. In between, the rule caught chiefs, lepers, and the mentally ill. It caught men nobody ever bothered to name in writing. This is the story of a single instruction that survived every regime that gave it. This is Robben Island. Jan van Riebeck came ashore in April of 1652 with instructions from Amsterdam that had nothing to do with settling a country. The Dutch East India Company wanted a halfway point, a place where ships bound for the spice routes could take on water, meat, and mail, then keep sailing. Nobody in that landing party was thinking about a colony. They were thinking about vegetables and cattle and how fast a ship could turn around in Table Bay. The Cape sat at the one point a ship rounding Africa had to pass before reaching the Indian Ocean trade. Nothing else nearby came close. That single fact made the anchorage worth more to the company than any land around it. Everything the settlement eventually became, a colony, a battleground, a prison system 3 centuries deep, grew out of a decision made for it, drinking water and vegetables, not empire. Van Riebeck's own instructions ran to several pages and barely mentioned how to govern people at all. They covered planning schedules and the rationing of stores. Government, in the sense of managing people who had not asked to be governed, was something the company backed into. It was never something it planned. The trouble started almost immediately. It started with people the company had not planned for. Khoikhoi herders already lived on that land, moving cattle along routes older than any Dutch garden. They did not recognize a fence as the end of an argument. Deserting sailors turned up on the wrong side of that fence too. So did soldiers who broke their contracts and slaves who ran the first chance they had. Within a few years, the settlement had a population it could not house and did not know what to do with. It had run out of room. There was no prison on the mainland built to hold anyone for more than a night. The settlement's few, soldiers were needed for the fences and the cattle trade far more than for standing guard. 11 kilometers offshore sat an answer nobody had to build from scratch. Robben Island already had a name. Dutch sailors had been landing there since the previous century to hunt seals and take on water of their own. Nothing else about it mattered yet. It had 2 qualities that made it useful the moment somebody needed a place to put a person they did not want to manage. Close enough that on a clear day, you could still see the mountain behind the settlement, far enough that swimming the gap killed most of the men who tried it. The ones the water did not take were usually finished off by the cold. That is not a figure of speech. There were no trees on the island worth building a raft from, no high ground worth defending, nothing a prisoner could use against the handful of soldiers sent to guard him. A garrison of a few dozen men could hold several dozen prisoners with almost no risk, because the ocean did most of the guarding for free. On paper, sending someone to Robben Island looked like banishment. In practice, it worked more like a filing system, a way to put a problem somewhere it stopped being visible from the mainland. Some of you already know one name connected to this water. Nelson Mandela spent 18 years on that island before he became president of a country the Dutch East India Company never meant to found. That part of the record has been told many times, by people better placed than this one to tell it. It is not where this account starts. By the time Mandela arrived, the rule that put him there had already been in continuous use for 300 years. It had outlived the company that invented it and the empire that inherited it. It had outlived most of the men who enforced it. Mandela was not even the only future head of state the island held. Kgalema Motlanthe and Jacob Zuma were both imprisoned there as young men too, decades before either of them became president in turn. 3 presidents, 1 island, out of a prisoner population that ran into the tens of thousands over the centuries. The odds on that are worth sitting with for a moment. Almost none of the others got a second chapter at all. Other empires ran penal colonies too, and most of them at least called the arrangement by its real name. France sent men to Guyana. Britain sent men to Australia. Both of those systems were designed on paper to end. A sentence had a number attached to it, and the number eventually ran out, even if what came after rarely looked like freedom. The Cape never bothered with that fiction in the same way. There was no pretense of an ending. Robben Island was never conceived as a colony a man might one day belong to. There was no future built into it. It was conceived as a hole a problem could be dropped into, with no obligation on anyone's part to ever pull it back out. We follow places like this one at a time, and there are a great many left to go. Following along costs nothing. Solving that problem meant building something. What it built said more about the settlement than any law it ever passed. By 1658, the governor at the Cape, Jan van Riebeck, had turned an informal habit into written policy. Anyone judged too dangerous, too troublesome, or simply too inconvenient to keep on the mainland could be rowed across to Robben Island and left there. No court in the Netherlands ever needed to review the order. None was required to. The system did not require a courthouse. It required a boat, a superintendent willing to receive prisoners, and a governor willing to sign. Here's the part that surprises people who assume banishment meant abandonment. The Dutch East India Company kept records, meticulous ones. A document from 1761, the Bondiette Roll, the Register of Banished Men, lists 70 prisoners on the island that year, 46. Shipped from company territory in the East Indies, 24 from Europe. By 1789, the number had grown to 134. The roll did not say how many of them ever went home. That inventory tells you something the buildings never could. Robben Island's real architecture in this period was not stone. It was paperwork. Ledgers, name lists, ration counts. And paperwork is a kind of building too, if enough of it survives. Every entry represented a decision made somewhere else, entirely, usually by company directors who never set foot on the island, on a ship many of them had never sailed on themselves. They never intended to visit. Distance in this system was not a flaw to be corrected, it was the mechanism itself, which is to say, the man who decided a Makassan nobleman or a Madarese prince belonged on Robben Island typically signed that order in a boardroom in Amsterdam. The men who carried it out at the Cape rarely knew more than a name and a charge. That was all they needed. The distance between the signature and the sentence was measured in months at sea, not minutes. By the time an objection traveled back to whoever made the decision, the prisoner had usually served longer than his original sentence required. Ships were slow, and paperwork was slower still. The paperwork had usually moved on to someone else's case entirely by the time any answer came back. And that was the point. A system built on that kind of distance does not need cruelty to be effective. It only needs patience, a filing cabinet, and an ocean willing to do the rest of the work. Nothing more was required. The Cape was one outpost among dozens the company operated between Amsterdam and Batavia, and Exile was a tool it reached for at most of them, not just this one. Ceylon held its own share of company prisoners, so did Batavia itself. Robben Island was simply the outpost where the practice happened to survive long enough and get documented well enough for the pattern to still be traceable 3.5 centuries later. The paperwork survived. That is the only real difference. The company itself was run from Amsterdam by a board of 17 directors, the Heren 17. They set policy for territories on 4 continents without ever agreeing, in writing, on how far that policy could stretch at any single outpost. Nobody defined the limit. The Cape was a minor concern to them. A resupply stop somewhere between the real business of spices and silver. A decision to banish a man for the rest of his life required less paperwork than a decision to reroute 1 cargo of cinnamon. Nobody with the authority to fix that imbalance ever had reason to notice it. By the early 1680s, the island held Muslim religious leaders exiled from the company's Indonesian territories, minor royalty from Makassar and Madura, and Khoi men who had simply refused an order. Some held out for years. Company officials rarely bothered recording why a given exile's faith was inconvenient in the first place, only that it was, which was usually judged reason enough. A holy man remembered as Said Akluri was recorded arriving in 1744, sent for teaching a faith the company found inconvenient. The record stops there. A nobleman remembered as the Prince of Madura died there a decade later in 1754, still listed as a prisoner of a company that had never once explained in writing what exactly he had done. No explanation ever came. Some of these men arrived with titles that meant something on the other side of the world and meant nothing at all once the ship docked at the Cape. A prince in Makassar was, on Robben Island, simply another entry on a ration list, housed in whatever shelter happened to be free that season. Rank did not travel well across that particular ocean. Nobody on the island decided their sentences. Somebody in an office decided them, then moved on to the next name. One name often gets attached to this island that does not actually belong to it. Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, a religious leader still honored today, was exiled to the Cape in 1694, after years resisting Dutch forces in Bantam. He never set foot on Robben Island, though. The company settled him at Zandvliet on the mainland, where his household became the seat of one of the Cape's oldest Muslim communities. The two get confused often enough that it is worth saying plainly here. Not everyone the company exiled ended up on this particular strip of water, just most of them. By 1682, the system had a name and a paper trail. Its first resident had already been added to it decades before the paper trail began. Autshumato, Harry the Dutch called him, had worked Robben Island for 8 years before anyone thought to imprison him there. That part still surprises people. Between 1632 and 1640, he served as an interpreter for European ships passing the Cape, trusted enough by the Dutch to hold that post unsupervised. Before that, he had spent time in Bantam in the company's Asian territories, picking up English and Dutch. That skill made him indispensable long before it made him briefly a prisoner. He knew the island's coves and currents better than most of the men later sent there against their will. In 1658, after a dispute over stolen cattle, von Riebeck had him rowed out and left on the ground he used to work. Not quite the ending anyone expected. Within a year, Autshumato and another prisoner stole a boat and rowed themselves back to the mainland. The escape worked, partly because nobody understood those currents better than the man who had charted them for the company. What happened next says something about how the company weighed loyalty against punishment. The same governor who exiled him let him go back to work as an interpreter for the rest of his life. He died in 1663, a free man, on the coast where he had once been marooned. His niece did not get the same ending. Krotoa, baptized Eva in 1662, the first recorded conversion of an indigenous woman at the Cape, grew up moving between two worlds that both discarded her. Taken into Van Riebeck's household as a girl of about 10, she spoke Dutch and Khoikhoi fluently within a few years. She became, for a time, the company's most valuable interpreter. It was not an easy position. One Khoikhoi leader, a man named Doman, accused her openly of favoring the colonists, telling her plainly she was trying to curry favor with the commander. Doman had led his own armed resistance against the Dutch a few years earlier. It failed. He had reason to resent anyone who worked as closely with the colonists as Krotoa did. He said so to her face. In 1664, she married a Danish surgeon named Peter von Meerhoff, in what the Dutch recorded as the first Christian marriage at the Cape. 4 years later, Van Meerhoff was killed on an expedition to Madagascar. Krotoa returned to the mainland a widow, caught between two societies that had each, in their own way, used her. Here's the part the record does not explain well. In March of 1669, officials banished her to Robben Island for what they wrote down as immoral behavior, a phrase that survives in the file and is never once defined in it. Nobody wrote down who decided a grieving widow qualified as a danger to the settlement. Nobody wrote that down. She died on the island on the 29th of July, 1674, 5 years into a sentence that was never given an end date because it was never meant to have one. Life for those early prisoners followed roughly the same shape year after year. A head count at first light, taken whether the wind was blowing or not, and the wind on that island blew hard enough that visiting officials complained about it in their own letters. Rationed grain, and little else, handed out by weight rather than need. Hours spent breaking stone or tending gardens, work that produced almost nothing a prisoner would ever benefit from. Winters were damp and short on fuel, since firewood had to be rowed in like everything else. The work was not designed to accomplish anything. It was designed to fill the hours until the next head count, and the one after that. By then, the pattern was already old. A man or woman crossed a line nobody had clearly drawn, and the island absorbed them without ceremony. Through the 1680s and beyond, Muslim scholars, minor royalty, and Khoikhoi leaders who resisted land seizures were added to that same register year after year. Nobody removed a name once it went in. The paperwork read like a census of everyone the Cape found inconvenient, updated year after year by clerks who never once seemed to have asked whether the list should have an end. Not everyone sent to the island accepted the sentence quietly. Makana, a Xhosa war doctor and general known to colonial writers as Nsili, led an attack of 6 to 10,000. Warriors against the British garrison at Grahamstown in April of 1819. The attack failed. Robben Island absorbed him afterward the way it absorbed everyone else. He did not stay long. Late that same year, he and roughly 30 other prisoners seized a boat and tried to row for the mainland. The boat swamped in the crossing. Only 4 men survived. Records disagree on the exact date. One account gives December of 1819, another gives December of 1820, but they agree on how it ended. Makana did not reach shore. David Sturman, a Khoikhoi leader who spent years resisting Dutch and British land seizures alike, escaped the island once already, in 1809, in a stolen whaling boat. He was recaptured. He kept resisting anyway for another decade, until officials ran out of patience with the mainland holding him at all. In February of 1823, he was loaded onto a convict ship, the Brampton, and sent to Sydney on the other side of the world from everything he had fought for. He died there 7 years later. The island did not just hold people. When holding them stopped working, the empire simply moved them farther away. Most of those names went unrecorded in any account beyond that register. One did not. This is the kind of history we built this channel to tell. The names most documentaries skip past in a single sentence. Maqoma was born around 1798 into the right-hand house of the Xhosa royal line, the son of a paramount chief named Nkika. Everyone at the Cape would come to know that name. By his 20s, the colonial administration at the Cape had already learned to take him seriously. He was not a ceremonial leader. He commanded armies, and he won often enough that British officers named him directly in their own dispatches. That was rare, in a period when colonial records mostly reduced African commanders to an undifferentiated enemy. Maqoma was different. In 1822, he established his own chiefdom along the Cat River, on land the colonial government considered its own. 7 years later, colonial forces expelled him from it by force. That expulsion did not end anything. Land taken from one chiefdom rarely stayed empty for long. Settler farms moved in almost as soon as the smoke cleared, which meant every expulsion also functioned as a down payment on the next war. Through the 1830s, Maqoma led resistance alongside his half-brother Tiali against the steady pressure of settler expansion. The pressure never let up. When the frontier wars escalated again in the 1850s, he became one of the few Xhosa commanders the British could not simply outlast. During what colonial records call the Eighth Frontier War, Maqoma held a stronghold in the Waterkloof for nearly 2 years. It was dense, broken terrain that made cavalry close to useless. In that campaign, his forces killed Lieutenant Colonel John Fordyce, a serving British officer, in open combat. That is not a detail a colonial administration forgives easily. The Xhosa had fought 9 separate frontier wars against the Cape Colony over the course of a century, and Maqoma had a hand in more of them than any single commander on either side. The colonial press in Grahamstown printed his name often enough that ordinary settlers would have recognized it on sight, the way a modern reader recognizes a general's name from the news. That kind of recognition cut in 2 directions at once. It made Maqoma a figure the administration could not simply write off. It also made him a figure the administration badly wanted gone. A chief who could kill a colonel and hold ground for 2 years was not, to the men governing the Cape, a problem that ended with a treaty. It ended instead on Robben Island. Maqoma was sent there for the first time and held roughly 12 years across 2 separate terms. He was paroled once in 1869 and allowed briefly to return to his old territory. He did not stay quiet. He used that freedom to try to reclaim land colonial. Law had already reassigned to white farmers. The response was immediate. Officials banished him a second time. This sentence had no parole attached to it. By then he was in his 70s, held largely alone, in a place built to keep him separate from anyone who might organize around his name. An Anglican chaplain assigned to the island stood with him at the end. Maqoma wept before he died on Robben Island on the 9th of September, 1873. That does not need an adjective added to it. A man who once defeated a British colonel in the field spent his final years fenced off from his own people. On a strip of land 11 kilometers from a coast, he could sometimes see. Nobody who signed the second banishment order ever had to sit in that room and watch what came of it. That was not an accident of how the system worked. That was how it was built to work. It had been built to work that way since 1658, and it would go on working that way for roughly another century after Maqoma's death on a great many other men whose names never made it into a chaplain's account of anything. Here's the part worth saying plainly. Maqoma was not treated as an exception. In 1858, a mass cattle-killing crisis, driven by a young prophetess named Nonkawus, left much of the Xhosa nation without cattle, grain, or the leadership it had trusted. Colonial authorities used the moment to ship a second wave of chiefs to Robben Island in a single group. Shaksho, Mala, Fato, Delima, Stockway, and Fadana among them. There was no room prepared for them. They were housed in huts covered with tarpaulins because permanent housing for prisoners of that rank had never been built. More chiefs kept arriving. Chief Langalibalele, who led the Yamahlubi people in the neighboring colony of Natal, followed in 1874. He was convicted of treason in a trial of British bishop. John Colenso later argued in public had no legitimate authority behind it at all. Colenso's campaign helped secure Langalibalele's release the following year. It was a rare outcome. None of the earlier chiefs lived to see one for themselves. Go through enough of these cases and the same shape keeps repeating. A leader resists colonial expansion. The colony wins the military argument, then makes the political argument disappear too, by removing the man who made it and putting 11 kilometers of ocean between him and anyone still listening. He was wrong about one thing, though. A different kind of scandal was already forming on that same island. It had nothing to do with war. In 1843, the colonial secretary at the Cape, John Montague, proposed a use for Robben Island that had nothing to do with chiefs or rebellion. He recommended it as a destination for lepers, paupers, and what the paperwork of the period called the mentally unfit and the chronically ill. Nobody softened that description. 3 years later, the recommendation became policy. The island's function changed almost overnight, from a place for people the colony feared to a place for people the colony simply did not want to see. The institution was called the General Infirmary, and the word is doing a great deal of work in that name. Care was not what it meant. By 1847, it held 194 patients under 13 staff, all under a resident surgeon named John Birtwistle, who became the facility's first surgeon superintendent that same year. Leprosy patients, patients with mental illness, and patients with unrelated chronic conditions were housed together, largely without separation by diagnosis. The building's name promised care. What it delivered, a government commission concluded 3 years later, was chains and beatings used as standard treatment. The building had been designed to hold a few dozen people comfortably and was, within a decade, holding several times that number. Overcrowding to the rest of the work, restraint did not finish. Patients who testified described being tied to their beds for entire nights. Staff described a ward run more like a holding pen than a hospital. That commission investigated Birtwistle between 1852 and 1855, working through testimony from staff and patients alike. Its conclusion survives in the record without embellishment. Forcible restraint by chaining and beating was found to be his ordinary method. That was not disputed. The embezzlement, oddly, was the easier charge to prove. Money left a paper trail. Chains left marks on a patient nobody in authority had bothered to examine until the commission finally did. Somebody finally looked. He was dismissed, not only for the treatment of patients, but for embezzlement uncovered in the same inquiry. His replacement, James Minto, inherited a system that had already taught its patients not to expect better. Minto's own tenure produced no scandal large enough to survive in the record. On this island, that counts as a kind of improvement. The numbers kept climbing anyway. By 1858, the asylum held 396 patients under a staff of 19, worse than the ratio that had triggered the original inquiry. Reform rarely outlasted the scandal that produced it. It did not need to stay that way, and for a while, it did not. A later superintendent, William Edmonds, introduced a more enlightened approach beginning in 1862. Less restraint, more structured activity, even organized recreation. Less chaining, more activity, more. Edmonds believed patients treated with ordinary courtesy caused fewer incidents than patients left idle and restrained. That reads today as fairly obvious. It read then, apparently, as a genuine innovation. Dances were organized for patients well enough to attend them. So was painting and fishing off the rocks when the weather allowed it. Small allowances that cost the colonial budget almost nothing and changed, for a while, how the institution actually felt from the inside. It did not last. On this island, reform never seemed to outlast the man who introduced it. Segregation followed the same pattern as everywhere else on the island, just applied to sickness instead of politics. The excuse changed. The result did not. In 1871, women with leprosy were moved off the island entirely, out of fear that children born there might carry the disease. They eventually returned, but were kept apart from male patients at Murray's Bay from 1886 onward. The fence made sure of it. By then, the island even had its own newspaper, printed for staff and patients, and called the Robben Island Times. A section reserved almost exclusively for black patients had its own name too. The kraal, a word borrowed from the language for livestock enclosures, applied to a ward built for human beings. Nobody chose that word by accident, which is to say, whatever the sign over the door claimed, the building sorted people the same way the island always had, by how much trouble they were, considered worth managing. A patient's race decided which side of a fence he woke up on more reliably than his diagnosis did. That was never written down anywhere. The institution's own charter never once mentioned race as a criterion for anything. Lepers were formally barred from traveling to the mainland at all between 1887 and 1889, sealing off a population already cut off from ordinary contact. International press coverage in those same years finally forced a select committee to examine conditions on the island more than 40 years after Montague's original recommendation. Go through enough of these places and the same pattern keeps turning up. The findings did not end the institution, they only slowed it down. The asylum survived one commission, then a second. It did not survive a change in the law. In 1931, the League of Nations Health Organization issued a finding that had taken decades to reach. Compulsory isolation of leprosy patients was no longer considered medically necessary. The ruling applied everywhere, not only at the Cape, but it landed on Robben Island like a verdict on 85 years of policy. The General Infirmary closed that year. Surviving patients were transferred to Westford Hospital near Pretoria. For the first time in close to 300 years, the island was empty of both the sick and the politically inconvenient. Every argument that finally worked was an argument about money and international standing, not about the men and women. Chained, beaten, or simply forgotten inside that infirmary. Those arguments had been made for decades by patients, by journalists, by at least one select committee. None of them closed the institution. A ruling issued in Geneva did. The island did not stay empty for long. By 1936, the Department of Defense had designated it a military reserve. When the Second World War reached southern waters, the buildings that once housed lepers gave way to a different kind of installation. Between 1939 and 1940, roughly 15,000 tons of building material were shipped across that same water to construct gun emplacements and command bunkers, some of them 30 feet underground. The scale of it was new. Nothing built on the island before in nearly 3 centuries had required that much material moved in that short a window. The island had never seen construction on that scale. A garrison of close to 3,000 troops was stationed there at its peak, housed in barracks segregated by race, same as everywhere else in the country. An airstrip went in during 1942, after fears of a Japanese naval attack led to the evacuation of the remaining civilians. None of it was ever used in combat. The guns stayed loaded and silent for the length of a war that never came close enough to fire them. No enemy ship ever came. Soldiers stationed there later described long stretches of boredom, broken by drills and fog, and the occasional false alarm. For once in its history, the island had become a place people were sent to wait rather than disappear. That distinction did not last. By then, the island had spent 3 centuries changing its stated purpose roughly once a generation. Every time, the underlying function survived the relabeling intact. Nobody who made that decision, generation after generation, ever had to stand where it landed. That was not an accident of the design, it was the design. In 1960, police opened fire on a crowd protesting the pass laws in the township of Sharpeville, killing 69 people. International condemnation followed within days. The government did not respond by loosening its grip. It responded by widening the machinery for holding people without trial, and an island already fitted with a garrison was the obvious place to expand it. Within a year, the Apartheid government had converted Robben Island into a maximum security prison for political detainees, opening in 1961 with just 11 original cells. 11 cells to start. Nobody who wrote that policy in Pretoria ever had to live inside one of those cells. That was not an oversight. Distance had always been the entire design, from the first order signed in 1658 to the last one signed 3 centuries later. The men who signed both orders never met. 300 years and an entire empire separated them. They reached for exactly the same tool anyway without apparently needing to consult it. New cell blocks went up quickly after 1964, once the Rivonia Trial sent Nelson Mandela and 7 other leaders of the African National Congress to serve life sentences there. That part of the story needs no introduction here. His own cell measured roughly 7 feet by 9, with a single barred window too high to see through, but sky. The limestone quarry where he and hundreds of other prisoners worked left its own mark. The glare off the white stone damaged his eyesight permanently. That detail needs no further comment added to it here. A year earlier, in 1963, a different prisoner had arrived under very different terms. Robert Sobukwe, founder of the Pan-Africanist Congress, was held in near total isolation from every other inmate for 6 years. He had started that party in 1959, breaking away from the African National Congress over strategy and leadership. That break mattered later. The following year, a demonstration his organization had planned against the pass laws ended in the shootings at Sharpeville. A clause added to a 1963 law let the government renew his detention annually, without trial, for as long as it chose. Renewal required no new evidence. He lived in a house with no running water in a section of the island once used to house colored warders rather than prisoners of any kind. He was allowed civilian clothing and a radio. He was not allowed conversation. He communicated with prisoners he could not approach, mostly through hand signals across a fence line during the brief windows both sides were permitted outdoors at once. His children visited exactly once, in 1967. He left the island in 1969, then spent most of the rest of his life under house arrest on the mainland until his death in 1977. A full list of sources sits in the description below. Anyone is welcome to check it. The prison's political section closed in 1991 as the negotiations that would end apartheid moved toward their conclusion on the mainland. A smaller section for ordinary criminal offenders stayed open 5 years longer until 1996, run by a government that no longer resembled the one that had opened it. The island went quiet again, only the second time that had happened in 300 years. Robben Island became a national museum in 1997 and a UNESCO World Heritage Site 2 years later, in 1999. It operates as a heritage site today, staffed in part by former political prisoners who now lead tours through the blocks where they were once held. Some of them do this daily. The ferry ride out from Cape Town takes about half an hour, across water that looks calmer from a modern deck than it ever did from a road one. Guides on the standard tour spend most of that visit on the years between 1961 and 1991. That is a fair use of 90 minutes. The other 270 years get a shorter mention, if they get one at all. In 2011, a Xhosa ceremony was held on the island to send home the spirits of 7 leaders who had died there, or whose remains were never fully accounted for. Makoma's name was read among them, alongside Shoksho, Delima, Sikangathi, Siolo, and Mafanta. It took 138 years, almost to the year, for that ceremony to happen. Here's a detail most tours do not lead with. Elsewhere on the island stands a small whitewashed shrine built in the 1960s by the same prison administration that ran the maximum security facility a short walk from it. It marks the grave of a man, not a general or a chief. It marks the grave of Sheikh Syed Abdurrahman Matura, a religious exile who died on the island generations earlier. By the time apartheid authorities built his shrine, he had become a figure Muslim visitors still traveled to honor. The irony went unremarked. The prison that enforced isolation as policy built a monument to a man remembered for comforting people in isolation. Nobody involved in approving the construction seems to have registered the contradiction, or if they did, nobody wrote that down either. The shrine got built anyway. It is an active pilgrimage site today, drawing hundreds of visitors each year for an annual commemoration of his death, most of them walking a route that passes within sight of the cell blocks without necessarily connecting the two. 4 different governments ran this island across 300 years, and each one told itself a different story about why. The company called it a solution to overcrowding. Colonial administrators called part of it medical care. The apartheid state called its version national security. Not one of those governments ever explained why the same 11 kilometers of water kept being the answer, no matter the question. The water never changed, only the excuses did. Overcrowding, medicine, security, national defense, 4 different words for the same 11 kilometers deployed by 4 administrations that otherwise agreed on almost nothing else about how to run the country around them. On this, somehow, they all agreed. The most famous prisoner this island ever held spent 18 years there and walked out to become his country's first democratically elected president. That fact is recorded on plaques, in textbooks, and in the ferry schedule that leaves Cape Town's harbor every day. Nobody wrote a plaque for Krotoa, banished for a phrase nobody ever defined. Nobody wrote one for Maqoma either. Not for 138 years. Nobody wrote one for the 194 people counted in a single year of an infirmary that ran for 85. The water around the island has not moved an inch since 1652. Only the reasons anyone gave for crossing it kept changing. 4 different governments, 1 strip of water, 300 years of paperwork explaining each time why this particular answer fit whatever the question happened to be. A Khoikhoi interpreter opened the file in 1658. The last cell on the island stood empty by 1996, though the museum that replaced the prison keeps adding pages of its own. Most of the men and women it was answered against never got a chapter of their own. A handful, at least, finally got a sentence. We go inside the places empires built beyond their own borders, one island at a time. And the empires built a great many of them.